If it's your first time at Café Scientifique, I'd like to wish you a warm welcome. If you've returned, then very welcome back. Obviously, we can't do these nights without your support, so thank you very much for taking your time out, and hopefully you'll enjoy yourself. Just a few things to begin with. We'll start off with a talk that'll be about half an hour, 45 minutes. Then we'll have a bit of a break so that you can refill your glasses and think of some interesting discussions for the second half, which I always like to think is the fun part of the evening, where we start getting into discussions around the topic that we're covering for the evening. Along those lines, there's just a couple of simple rules. Not that there are really any rules. The first one is there's no such thing as a silly question. So if you've got a question you want to ask, don't think, oh well, I might look silly, because often that's where the most interesting discussions, sorry Josie, revolve around some of the more way out questions. We've had some very interesting discussions in here of an evening. The other thing is, it's fine, it's an informal setting, but if you are having a bit of a discussion with your friend, try and remember that the people round about you are trying to listen to the talk. It's not exactly, a large lecture theatre or anything like that, that it's quite easy for people to be interrupted. So all that remains is for me to introduce our speaker for this evening, Josie Pegg, who's going to give us a wonderful insight into the world of parasites and where they fit in within our world. So thank you very much, Josie.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming out on a Tuesday evening to talk about parasites. I'm Josie, I work at Bournemouth University, and I guess I consider myself a fisheries scientist, but for the last few years I've been working on fish parasites, and I've kind of got quite into parasites, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you tonight.
Is it on the side? No, sorry Sharon, the clip is switched on.
It's on.
I think it's just stuck. The trainer, I was going to say.
Okay, got the tech working. Okay, so by definition, a parasite is an organism that lives in or on another organism, its host, and benefits by deriving nutrients or some other form, for example protection, at the host's expense. So parasites aren't necessarily something people want, and actually there's this really sort of negative connotation attached to a parasite. So much so that the word parasite is actually used as a derogatory term for a person who habitually relies on or exploits others. But I think that's a really old-fashioned way of looking at these animals. Parasites are everywhere. They're incredibly numerous. If you were to count every single species on the planet, from the tiniest unicellular organisms up to mankind, about 75% of those species would be parasitic. Not a half, not a quarter, 75%. So for each of us free living organisms, there are 3 parasites on this planet. They are everywhere. And hopefully tonight I'll show you that they're both bad, but good too. In fact, bad and good is a very human way of looking at them. But they are very essential to this planet that we live on. Firstly, I want to start with the traditional view of parasites. And I just want to ask, who here is aged between 0 and 25 years? Quick show of hands. Okay, you guys are around the 25% risk. Who's 25 to 50? Yeah, you lot are approaching the sort of 50% risk level. And I won't get you to put your hands up, but if anybody's in the 50 to 80 age category, then you're approaching 70% risk. If you're wondering what the risk is, it's infection by this. The eyelash mite. Incredibly common. Actually, based on those numbers, we'd say, what, I guess a dozen of you here present today are infected. Parasitism is normal. It is everywhere, but it's a little bit creepy. If I start talking about eyelash mites, are you starting to feel a little bit itchy in the eyes? If you're over 90, chances are you'd be 100% likely to be infected, so just bear that in mind before you give a nan a hug. Or we can start talking about nits. This is one that really makes people feel creepy. Can you feel them? Can you feel them on the back of your neck? Yeah, nits. In this case, they're more common in children, so again, avoid nans, avoid children. But on the bright side, at least you're not a fish, and you're not likely to be infected with this guy, Simothea extigua. This is the fish tongue parasite, and it lives in the water column as a juvenile. It finds a fish, it enters the fish through its gills, attaches itself at the base of the tongue. It then eats the fish's tongue, replacing the tongue with itself, and it then lives inside the fish, eating what the fish eats, enjoying the protection of being inside a fish for the entirety of its life. But those are all direct parasites, parasites passed from host to host, possibly with a free living stage in between. But parasites get really, really interesting when you start thinking about those that have more than one host within their life cycle. These parasites, what we term trophically transmitted parasites, in that they move up the trophic levels of the food web, employ some really clever tactics to make sure that the intermediate hosts that they occupy are more likely to be consumed by their final hosts. This is an ant. This is a pretty normal ant. But if this ant was parasitised with a lancet fluke, it would employ some very strange behaviour. The lancet fluke has two stages in its life cycle. Partly within an invertebrate, such as an ant, but its final host is ungulate, so something like a cow or an ox. So that parasite's purpose in life is to reach its final host. And when it's inside its intermediate host, it wants to increase that animal's chance of being eaten. So, a parasitised ant will do a very, very strange thing. By day it behaves like an average ant going about its anti-business. But as the evening comes around, the ants suddenly take on a trance-like state and walk to the top of the blades of grass and just sit there, waiting for a cow to come along and eat it, thereby facilitating the parasite's life cycle. This is an even more gross or fascinating, depending on how you look at these things, parasitic scenario. This is a caterpillar. This is a caterpillar that has been parasitised by a parasitic wasp. A parasitic wasp will come along, find a caterpillar, land on it, and lay its eggs within the caterpillar. Now there's two things about a parasitic wasp. It lays its eggs within the caterpillar, and it carries a virus. Now what slowly happens over about 12 days is that those eggs hatch within the caterpillar, and once they're mature enough to be laid as such, they will exit the caterpillar, at which point the virus, which accompanies the parasitic wasp larvae, alters the brain of the caterpillar. So this caterpillar has just basically had its insides noshed on by the parasitic wasp larvae, which have then exited its body. And you're thinking now it would probably make a run for the hills, but no, because the virus has altered the functioning of its brain, it protects the parasite. It will cocoon them, and it will guard them with its life, until eventually it puts so much effort into guarding its parasitic wasps that it will starve to death. It's a tragic story and rather horrific. And in fact, parasites have very much been the basis of a lot of horror. Chestburster, parasitic wasp, it's a very fine line. But in case you're feeling too traumatised, here's a nice picture of a cat. Oh no, except I want to tell you a little bit about cats. Cats can be infected by a parasite called Toxoplasmosis gondii. This is a parasite that historically was transmitted between rats and cats. So the cats being the final host, the rats or other similar vermin being the intermediate host. So the action that the parasite took on the rats was to alter its behaviour to make it less afraid of cats, therefore increasing the likelihood of it being predated, which works. Except we have a lot of contact with cats, and over time this parasite has ended up, due to close physical contact, being transmitted from cat to person. When this parasite gets inside a person, it also alters the minds of people. And there's been some really fascinating studies done on this, because whilst we're not rats, therefore our fear of cats would not be very useful, it does produce chemical changes. And the studies have found that men who are infected with toxoplasmosis are more risk-taking, whilst women are more sociable and outgoing. Now, if you think of the sort of likelihood of being eaten by a cat, those are probably processes that would somewhat increase it. So if you're worrying about parasites and thinking of ways to avoid them, you really want to avoid old people, young people, beloved pets. There's probably a few more in there as well. So that's parasites. And that's very much how people think of parasites. But I think that's really old-fashioned. I think that view of parasites as being the stuff of horror movies, you know, a threat, a risk, generally gross and unpleasant, it sort of dates back to the Victorian times. Victorians were, you know, a lot of interesting sort of biology was taking place in the Victorian times, but they were incredibly dismissive of parasites. There was this sort of idea that parasites were degenerate somehow, like they were some sort of creature that had evolved and then de-evolved. They were nasty. And unfortunately, for years following, parasites have been sort of relatively poorly studied and really relatively poorly understood. But that started to change. In the last few decades, there have really been some sort of scientific developments that sort of challenge you to take a different look at parasites. So we're all here tonight. This is Café Scientifique, not Café Victorian Prejudice. So this is my defence of parasites, and I'm going to look at current knowledge, the sort of ecological, genetic, evolutionary and medical aspects that we can, context that we can think about parasites in, and hopefully challenge some of those preconceptions about what a parasite is. So, I am an ecologist. I work looking at sort of ecosystem modelling, and I wanted to explain to you how parasites fit within this. And I realised that actually it's quite a complex subject. So I have decided, with the help of 5 volunteers, that I believe I can do this using the medium of a silent movie. So please can I have 5 volunteers to come up to the front? Come on, Adrian. Any 5 of you will do.
I think that counts as volunteering.
No.
Come on, 2 more. Oh, are you in?
Yeah.
Come on, 1 more volunteer. Just 1 more.
That's what you brought students along for, isn't it?
1 more. Come on. Right. Okay. There we go. If you hold that, you may notice there's something on the back. It will become self-evident in a moment. There we go. we go. There we go. And there we go. If you'd like to move around a bit so we can see you all. You can come in front of the screen. We don't need the screen for a moment. Okay. Thank you very much, volunteers.
Sorry, can I just move so that's not blinding me?
I would like to take you on an imaginary ecological journey to an island. A really, really dull island. On this island, there are very limited life forms. We have moss, we have grass, we have rabbits, and we have foxes. And that's it. And they exist upon the island. And the rabbits are all very healthy. And the rabbits eat grass, and the foxes eat rabbits. And the moss photosynthesizes in the sunshine. So, imagine we have a very, very hot summer, and the grass dies. And there's no food for the rabbits, and the rabbits die. And there's no food for the foxes, and the foxes die. Unlucky. But we're all right in this scenario. Everybody alive again. This time, some of the rabbits, a proportion of the population, are parasitised. These rabbits are rather less healthy than the other rabbits. They grow more slowly, they have less reproductive success, but they survive. They survive because instead of eating the grass, they eat the moss. It's a suboptimal food type, but it's a food type. Okay, imagine the situation again. It's a blazing hot summer. The grass dies. The rabbits that eat the grass die. The parasitised rabbits survive because the moss survives. So some of the foxes can survive. So we have less of an ecological collapse. And that's how parasites can alter a system. By adding complexity, they can decrease the vulnerability to extinctions. If I said to you guys, is biodiversity good? Most people would say, yes, biodiversity is good. And this is what parasites can do. They can increase the complexity, they can increase the biodiversity, and they can reduce the vulnerability of a system to extinctions. So thank you very much, guys. To my islanders. And they didn't actually die. They're all fine.
No rabbits were wrong. Yeah, no more from you traumatised by those rabbits.
If that all seems a little bit silly and theoretical, it's not. This is actually what I work on. This is some of my data from my research. I've been looking at the effects of parasites on fish. This is a carp infected by Bothriochelys, which is the Asian tapeworm. This is a stable isotope biplot. What a stable isotope biplot shows is the dietary niche of the animals that you sampled. Along this axis is the nitrogen, and along this axis is the carbon. I won't spend ages explaining stable isotopes, but essentially the nitrogen value is related to how high in the food chain the animal sits. So the higher on this axis, the further up the food chain. So a predator will be high up, a piece of grass will be low down the food chain. The carbon signature is indicative of the source at the bottom of the food chain. So for example, if you had a terrestrial plant versus an aquatic plant, you would have a different carbon signature. So if you look at the spots on this graph, the red spots are indicative of fish that have no parasites, and the black spots are parasitized fish, all from within the same population. And you can see that this trophic niche, so the general diet of the healthy fish, is different to the general diet of the parasitized fish. When you look at what they're actually eating, these fish eat more marginal food types. So they eat, for example, snails, invertebrates that live around the margins of the pond. These guys have a more planktivorous life cycle. So although plankton is perhaps less nutritious, you can see how they're slightly lower in the food chain where they sit. They're eating something different. Well, if you take away the, scorching summer, the grass dies scenario from the food web and say it's a scorching summer and the water retreats from the margins of the lake, what you've actually got is a real life representation of the rather silly play. So that's the ecosystem argument for why parasites are actually useful. They increase complexity, they reduce vulnerability within systems. But there's other reasons. When I was doing my research, I came across a paper by a German team that was really fascinating. They were looking at the genetic makeup of different fish species. And they looked at these different species. This is a Chinook salmon, it's a North American species. This is a Wells catfish, which is a sort of subtropical Asian-esque species. You've got perch, that's a temperate species, temperate freshwater species. You've got burbot, which is brackish, so that's slightly saline, subarctic species. They're very diverse, they're continents apart. But when they looked at the genetics, they found some really odd genetic signatures that linked these four species. And they couldn't understand why. These genes were sort of old genes, and they were found in four different species that were sort of very behaviourally, very life cycle, very geographically distinct. And then they looked at the genetics of this guy. This is a Parasitic Lamprey. Now, Parasitic Lamprey sort of diverged on the evolutionary tree about 500 millennium from the other bony fish species. And so they have a very different genetic signature. And it was genes of this species that they were finding within the other species. What did the other species have in common? They were all parasitized by this fish. And then when they started looking at the DNA of this fish, they found that there was some odd, very modern genetic material that it had scavenged from its host. When you start looking at gene transfer, this horizontal gene transfer from parasite to host, or from host to parasite, is actually very, very common. But it's not something people think about a lot. This guy has got schistosomiasis. The inflamed belly is swollen spleen. And this is the schistosome worm. And when the genetic code was mapped for the schistosome worm, what did they find in it? Quite a lot of human DNA, where this worm, by parasitizing the humans, had taken up DNA. Well, okay, why is that a good thing? I want to think about it from an evolutionary perspective. This horizontal gene transfer occurs very rarely in complex animals. The lamprey example was very noteworthy because it's very, very rare. But among simple animals like this is an amoeba, the movement of body parts, of genes and whole genes between both the consumer, the prey, or the parasite and the host is actually very, very common. We tend to think of evolution happening like this. It's a tree. You go up the branches. It's a vertical process. Genes are passed from parent to offspring, and the successful genes are passed on. But down here, back in the sort of very, very beginning of time, that wasn't how it was happening. That's very true for complex animals, but right back in the early days when we were like this, actually this horizontal gene transfer, this mixing of genetic material between very, very simple animals was very common and very much the sort of driver of higher evolution. And we still see the tiny relics of this really important process in sort of modern parasite host populations. But parasites have also been important in evolution, even higher up the tree of complexity. There's this idea about the sort of known as the Red Queen hypothesis, and the title comes from Alice Through the Looking Glass, where the Queen says, "Now, here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place." Now, some people say that's a quote about doing a PhD, but I would argue, and many others have, that it's quite an apt description of the evolutionary processes that occur if you imagine an organism and a parasite or a predator, you can interchange the two in this example, whereby the parasite develops some mechanism by which it can prey better upon its host. The host then develops some mechanism whereby it can defend itself. Therefore, over time, those that are best at evolving these new survival mechanisms survive. And that's basically the evolutionary process. And if you consider back to the scales of parasites, we're thinking 75% of life is parasitic. You can sort of get an idea of the scale of how important this process has been for all animals, parasites and free-living animals. So that's my evolutionary argument for the importance of parasites. My final argument is that parasites can be harnessed. There's a hypothesis that is discussed quite often recently in the medical literature called the hygiene hypothesis. As humans, we now have access to far better living conditions, far more variety of food. Everything is on tap. So we should be just getting healthier and healthier and healthier, right? Except that within humans now, there is an incredibly rapidly increasing occurrence of autoimmune diseases. And this hygiene hypothesis derives from the idea that because our environments are becoming more and more and more sterile, our immune systems are attacking themselves as they've got nothing to fight. Where do parasites come into this? Well, what happens if you start putting the parasites back? And that's what doctors are looking at doing. There's been some really, really interesting research gone on. This is a whipworm. It's a pork worm. Well, it affects pigs. But researchers have put the eggs of this worm into sufferers of Crohn's disease. The results have been incredibly positive. It's ingested as eggs and then it attaches in the stomach. Because humans aren't its final host, it'll only last within the stomach for between 2 and 3 weeks before it dies and it's passed, and they have to ingest some more. But during that period, the effect that the worms has is that it alters the behaviours of the T cells. T cells are your immune cells. And in a condition like Crohn's, these immune cells are attacking your own body. But when there's a worm present, they stop attacking their own body and they rebalance. Those that are the T cells within the body that are useful for fighting off disease increase. The T cells within the body that attack the own body tend to decrease. Also, one of the other effects of having these eggs or worms within the gut is that the whole gut microflora changes. You've probably seen the adverts for, healthy bacteria, buy this expensive yogurt, blah, blah, blah. The yogurt probably doesn't do very much good, but the science is true. Having a diverse, healthy gut bacteria is actually a very healthy state to be in. And by the addition of parasites like this, it can actually rebalance people's guts. So this is one line of attack. using parasites medically that's actually already produced some really exciting results. There's other things going on. There's another really exciting project going on in the States at the June laboratories, whereby genetic material that relates to the behaviour of T cells from the same group of viruses that HIV belongs to, HIV being incredibly well studied, so they've got lots of ideas about its working, have been transplanted into the T cells of leukemia sufferers, and then have actually started to attack the leukemia rather than the bodies of the sort of sufferers. So there's a huge amount of sort of very, very exciting parasite-based medical work that kind of plays on this idea that parasites are clever. Parasites have these sort of tools within them to get around the defences of their host. But when those hosts are defending something that doesn't need to be defended, when it's become autoimmune, actually adding the parasites can be very, very beneficial. So, as I kind of wrap up my talk part of the talk, the question that I titled this talk with was, are parasites horrors or heroes? Well, undeniably, if you look at certain host-parasite interactions, one host, one parasite, then you could say occasionally they're a little bit horrific. But I think they're heroes, and I think they're heroes for this reason. You are here, you are the Homo sapien, you are the animal that you have evolved to be because of evolutionary processes that parasites are incredibly and utterly involved in. You exist within the environment that surrounds us, the ecosystem that we live in, all the plants, all the animals, that function because they are moderated. We do not live in this system of boom and bust, except occasionally when people mess things up. The balance of nature is incredibly delicate and nuanced, and parasites are absolutely critical to that. Finally, I'd say your future may depend on parasites. When you consider the medical potential of these creatures, it could be you. It could be you they're helping in the future. Our population is growing, diseases, aging, it's all going on. And these could be a real key, not necessarily George Clooney, but the parasites could be a real key to a happy, healthy future. And so I end my defence of parasites. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josie. I certainly can agree that you've made parasitology a lot more interesting than any of the lectures I had. When my lecturer bothered to turn up, that was. We'll just have a short break and hopefully somebody will appear, as if by magic. Heather will appear, and yeah, feel free to charge your glasses, have a think about any of the discussion you want to bring up, and we'll get started again in about 10 minutes. Thank you.